Welcome to this week's episode of Accredited Investor Markets Radio. Each week, we speak with you about investing in alternative assets. Unbiased and beholden to no one, Accredited Investor Markets Radio does not accept advertising from any investment firm or financial advisor. Accredited Investor Markets Radio is the spoken word sister of AccreditedInvestorMarkets.com, the internet's most comprehensive and unbiased educational resource about crowdfunding, angel investing, venture capital, private equity, private shares, and other investment classes beyond publicly traded stocks and bonds.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Accredited Investor Markets Radio. I am Christopher Cahill. Have you thought about Philately lately? Well, maybe you should. Later on, we're going to talk with Chad Snee about Philately, that is, stamps, and the investment in rare stamps that one might engage in. I should mention that Bill Gross of PIMCO and Janet Yellen of the Federal Reserve are two investors in rare stamps. So the discussion will, I warn you, it will touch on bonds and monetary policy. But let's leave talk of stamps for the interview. Let's talk instead about dolls. That's right, dolls. Not Cupid dolls, but Curie dolls, as in Madame Curie. Madame Curie, of course, was born in 1867 and was born Maria Sklodowska of Poland. She became Pierre Curie's wife when she came to the Sorbonne to study and to teach and to research. She and her husband shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903, and in 1911 Marie Curie won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry by herself for the discovery of radium. What's that have to do with dolls? Well, there are Madame Curie dolls. Two young women who studied engineering at the University of Illinois who want to inspire girls to become scientists by offering dolls based upon real people like double Nobel Prize winning Marie Curie, have founded the Miss Possible company to offer an alternative to Barbie dolls or American Girl dolls. The founders are Jana Eves and Supriya Hobbs. And I'm reading from a press release of the Here and Now radio program, which has been aired on public radio. So, where did Ms. Eves and Ms. Hobbs get their funding? They got their funding, at least the first $85,000, from the crowdfunding website Indiegogo. Well, crowdfunding. Now, that kind of crowdfunding is just giving away money. So people believed in their ethical project, their educational project, and gave these two gals the money to start this company. This is historically consistent, by the way, the funding of Curie dolls with the funding of Marie Curie herself. Marie Curie came to the United States, and by 1920 she wanted some radium to work with and a laboratory. I say laboratory because movies of the early sound era always use the word laboratory, at least the ones I've heard. Anyway, Curie needed these things, and a journalist named Missy Brown Maloney somewhat famously launched a fundraising campaign, and in 1920, $100,000 were raised, which got both the radium and the laboratory for Madame Curie. And this provided the great scientist a place to work until she succumbed to radium-induced illness in 1934. All right, so that's crowdfunding as gift, and that's what crowdfunding is today, largely, but not exclusively, as we shall see. Here in the United States, crowdfunding is a little more liberally administered elsewhere. So essentially, gifts of money. This is not the purchase of an ownership interest in a company. It's not the purchase of a right of payment. So it's not the purchase of equity or debt. It's not the purchase of a security. It's just the funding of a project you happen to like. But one more example of contemporary crowdfunding in the United States. Among the afflictions suffered by Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 was mob violence. In a Wall Street Journal article dated March 23, 2015 by Ben Kiesling and Leslie Josephs entitled Battered Businesses Tap into Crowdfunding, is described the problem and solution for Juanita Morris. Juanita Morris owned a clothing store called Fashions R Boutique, which offered colorful women's wear she describes as church clothes. Well, the thing was burnt down by a mob. Afterward, A youngster, a college student, called up the 69-year-old Ms. Morris and got her to agree to set up a profile page on GoFundMe. $22,900 appeared from around the world, sufficient to plug holes left after insurance, and Ms. Morris has opened up a new store. But let us return to real crowdfunding, crowdfunding of securities, crowdfunding of pieces of equity and pieces of debt. We know that has been in the air. It's been essentially promised by the 2012 Jobs Act passed by the Congress and signed into law by President Obama. One thing about the Jobs Act you should realize is that it has multiple parts. Title III is the one that concerns itself with equity and debt crowdfunding, or the crowdfunding of securities. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, filed a letter in opposition to Title III of the Jobs Act, but it was passed and signed into law nevertheless. The law provided a deadline of December 2012 for the SEC to propose new rules. The SEC took its time and proposed new rules only on October 23, 2013. The Act and the rules following the Act require a lot for equity crowdfunding of securities. The securities may be offered, the offering may be made only through a broker-dealer or a funding portal intermediary, and it must be done via publicly accessible internet platforms. The requirements include prescribed disclosures and prescribed investor education and due diligence obligations on the part of the funding portal intermediaries or broker-dealers. Okay, that's just the offering part. What about what you can offer? The prescribed regulations limit the amounts an offering can raise to $1 million over 12 months. Okay, well, maybe it's just then there for smaller offerings. You might crowdfund into only smaller offerings. But it also imposes very strict and onerous rules, really, I think, on to whom you may sell these pieces. If an investor's net worth or annual income is less than $100,000, the issuer may sell that investor no more than $2,000 worth of equity or debt, or 5% of that investor's net worth or annual income. If the investor has an annual income or net worth of $100,000 or more, then the issuer may sell to that investor no more than 10% of that investor's annual income or net worth, but in any case no more than $100,000. So add all that up with extensive disclosure rules, restrictions on advertising and promotion, and restrictions on resale. So obviously a substantial portion of the value of any security that one buys is affected by the ability to resell it, by the kind of market you could resell it into. Well, if you buy a security as a crowdfunding investor under these rules, you may not transfer that security for an entire year after you buy it, unless you sell it to the issuer, to an accredited investor, so somebody with means, or as part of an offering registered by the SEC, or to a member of your family, or to a trust controlled by you, or a trust created for the benefit of a member of the family, and that sort of thing. All of this requires a great deal of information exchange, verification, and liability pointing in various directions that are not laid out in the regulation, which should lead to fruitful areas of litigation. And it's a blessing, really, that these rules have not been finalized and have not been made part of the Federal Register. And when I say blessing, I'm uttering my own opinion. However, Stephen Davidoff Solomon of the New York Times wrote an article published in November 18, 2014, entitled SEC's Delay on Crowdfunding May Just Save It. And the article is valuable because it describes what happens if the SEC doesn't do anything. What if the states want crowdfunding? Well, under the law, a state may create its own crowdfunding rules in the absence of a federal rule. We don't have a federal rule yet, so the states may create their own crowdfunding rules, and 13 states have done so, including Texas, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan. In the Texas case, a company is, as in the federal case, limited to raising only $1 million over a 12-month period. And it has to do so through a privately run portal that vets the companies. Okay, that's a little bit like the federal requirement, but there are no annual filing requirements, so it's easier. All that by way of saying we live in exciting times of legal inventiveness on the part of states with regard to issuers of crowdfunding within those states, and whatever battle is going on in Washington with regard to SEC rules on equity and debt crowdfunding. There's a lot to learn, and I'd like to suggest to you that you can learn a lot by looking at our website. Accredited Investor Markets Radio is part of accreditedinvestormarkets.com or AIMkts.com, and this website has a great deal of resources for your perusal, including the entire text of Title III of the Jobs Act. That is on the website. Numerous articles on crowdfunding, its progress, and its relationship with venture capital, for example, are on the website. Our sister website, financialpoise.com, offers webinars in equity crowdfunding and debt crowdfunding. These are webinars from past years, which can help you disentangle what's going on or what sorts of opportunities there might be for equity crowdfunding and debt crowdfunding once these become available to ordinary people. Further, this year, in the upcoming months, financialpoise.com will be offering the following webinars. On June 4th, 2015, the site will offer a live webinar entitled, What is the Jobs Act and Why Should You Care? On July 9th, 2015, Financial Poise will offer, What is Equity Crowdfunding and Should it Matter to You? In each case, the panelists will include legal experts on crowdfunding as well as senior executives from CrowdCheck and Early Shares. I'd like to suggest that you can learn a lot from AccreditedInvestorMarkets.com. Well, having said all that, let us leave you to the glories of stamp investing. Today, we have with us as our guest Charles Snee, who goes by Chad Snee. And Mr. Snee is the editor of Linn's Stamp News and Scott Publishing Company, both of which are owned by Amos Media Co of Sidney, Ohio, and Chicago. Scott produces the Scott brand of postage stamp catalogs, which include the 6-volume worldwide Scott Standard Postage Stamp Catalog and Scott Specialized Catalog of United States Stamps and Covers and the Scott Classic Specialized Catalog of Stamps and Covers 1840 to 1940. As you might divine from that introduction so far, this is going to be about investments in stamps, which is actually a quite lively and quite expansive field. And thus, I can say that Mr. Snee is an accomplished philatelist with 15 years of professional editorial reporting and writing experience in the stamp hobby media. In January 2014, Mr. Snee assumed his current duties as editor of Linn's and Scott. He enjoys in particular collecting the stamps of Ireland and Scandinavia, as well as United States postal history. Well, Chad, did I pronounce it right when I said philatelist?
Thanks for having me, Chris. Yes, you did.
Good.
That term is a fancy way of saying stamp collector, and philately is the fancy way of saying stamp collecting.
All right.
We here at Linn's tend to emphasize stamp collecting and stamp collectors, and not so much the highfalutin term there, which tends to put some folks off because they don't really know what it means. But you did pronounce it correctly, so kudos to you.
Well, I think most people know what Elvis means.
Certainly, from a musical standpoint.
Well, maybe even from
you're asking about Elvis stamps?
I am asking about Elvis stamps because I understand that some countries like to produce Elvis stamps. Do you know how many countries have issued Elvis stamps, and maybe who was first to do so?
Well, I did a little digging around. I couldn't nail it down to a specific number of countries. However, according to our nation's largest affinity group, those who collect topical stamps, the American Topical Association, almost 300 stamps have been issued depicting the King of Rock and Roll. St. Vincent was the first country to do so when it issued a set of 4 stamps and 4 stamp souvenir sheets in 1985.
Ah, so they all waited until the king was gone. But
yes. I mean, it was although the president of the ATA, when we had a recent discussion about this, she found it rather surprising that it took 8 years for a country to put Elvis on a stamp. 8 years after he died in 1977.
I guess it was just too soon, you know.
Well, perhaps. The United States Postal Service, you might know, followed suit in 1993 when it issued its 29-cent Elvis stamp, which was a runaway bestseller at post office.
Oh, yes.
I mean, ever since that stamp was issued, the Postal Service has pined to have another Elvis stamp phenomenon occur, where loads of people go to the post office and they buy sheets of this stamp and they tuck them away in their drawers and don't use them on them.
Well, all right, let's get to the gravamen of this podcast, which is, would an investor be wise to collect Elvis stamps, and what is it? Why would an investor collect any stamps?
Well, for the Elvis stamps, I would say that's probably not a good place to park one's investment dollars. While they are certainly popular, they're readily available from many, many sources, many dealers. They're never going to be rarities in that sense. So for your typical return on investment, not a good place to spend your money. You're better off simply collecting them for the sake of collecting them and enjoying them that way.
Which a lot of people do, but there's two different worlds, right? Collectors and investors.
Yes, there are two different worlds. We tend, in our work here, to emphasize the collecting side of things because the vast majority of our readers and catalog users are in the hobby to collect and to enjoy the collectible objects, the stamps. However, there are, I guess you could say, investment opportunities out there.
Well, what are the main factors of value for a particular stamp that makes it good for investment?
Well, generally speaking, the main factors for any given stamp are what we call the grade of the stamp and its condition. Now, by grade, we mean how well the design of the stamp is centered within its margins. The better the centering, the more valuable the stamp in general. Now, for used stamps, those that have been placed on a letter, have gone through the mail, and have had a postmark applied to them, the grade will also encompass the cancellation or postmark on the stamp. So a common, say, wavy line postmark is probably not going to do too much to add value to the stamp, but if it has a real pretty pictorial type cancel on it, particularly ones from, say, the 19th century, early 20th century, the presence of that marking on the stamp can add a great deal of value to it. There are certain fancy pictorial cancels, United States cancels, fancy cancels we call them, that can greatly increase the value of a used stamp when that marking is on the stamp. Now, the second factor is called condition. And condition, broadly speaking, refers to factors other than grade that can affect the stamp's desirability and hence its value. And they're positive and negative factors. Some of the positive ones would include the gum on the back of the stamp, the adhesive never having been hinged and placed in a stamp album, a stamp with an exceptionally fresh color, a stamp with unusually wide margins. You sometimes read the term boardwalk margins in an auction description. And there are also certain scarce printing varieties that can affect the condition of a stamp and increase its value. Now, negative factors would be the loss of original gum on these older stamps, primarily stamps from the 19th century, the presence of a hinge remnant on the back of the stamp, a little piece of folded paper that a collector uses to mount a stamp on an album page, natural faults such as paper inclusions, and straight edges. Collectors don't like stamps where one or more sides are straight instead of having the perforations. It disrupts the symmetry and balance and look to the stamp. And then finally, other negative factors are faults, such as a stamp that's been regummed to make it look like it's never had a hinge put on it, a stamp that's been reperforated, tears, thins, creases, toning, short perforations, or, for example, the chemical removal of a cancellation to make a stamp appear as though it's never been used.
Well, okay, all of that, and you haven't touched on every element of value in great detail, but...
Oh, no, those are the highlights. I mean, there are other things, but those are the highlights, the ones that most collectors understand and are familiar with.
Well, it would sound like for somebody who really wants to get the benefit from whatever investment quality Stamps has, that person will need an expert. to help steer that person correctly?
In some cases, yes. Yes.
Well, now let's get to the money then. Is the stamp market a global market? How many people are in this market? How much is invested? What can you say about that?
Well, I would say that the stamp market's global in the sense that there are stamp collectors all around the world, not just here in the United States. It's been a number of years since we at Linn's did an accurate survey of the U.S. market, but just doing some quick back-of-the-flap calculations recently, I would say at least within the United States, there are probably 3 to 5 million or so what we would call stamp savers, the folks that go to the post office and then buy a sheet of Elvis stamps, for example. A slightly smaller number, maybe 1 to 2 million casual collectors. These are folks that might subscribe to a new issue service, either from a dealer or from the Postal Service to acquire stamps. And then we get into the serious collectors, which I would estimate are anywhere from, say, 100,000 to, say, 130,000, 40,000 people here in the country. And these are the folks that read or, in some cases, don't read philatelic publications such as Linn's Stamp News. But they're plugged into the hobby on a regular basis. They're making purchases on a regular basis, either monthly or maybe even with a greater or lower degree of frequency. So that's basically what the market might look like today.
Is there an increasing presence of foreign, and we're talking about investment stamps now, is there an increasing presence of foreign stamp investors who may be affecting the market?
I suppose it would depend on the material that they're after. For example, if a major collection put together by someone over many, many years comes onto the market and is sold at auction, the auction firm is certainly going to do its level best to promote and advertise the upcoming sale, and of course that will get the attention of not only well-heeled collectors here in the United States, but also collectors of means living outside of the United States. And because the Internet makes it so easy to bid online and to participate in an auction no matter where you are, it's much easier today for collectors overseas to be active participants in the stamp market here in the United States.
Well, that would seem to suggest, if you have a constant supply of stamps worth a certain amount, that if you expand the market through Internet modes, that would suggest that prices are going to go up because more people are competing for the same number of stamps. Has that?
In general, that's correct. And that particularly applies to the rare and scarce. There's an old saying in the stamp hobby that rare and desirable stamps become more rare and desirable over time, but common stamps just remain common.
Well, speaking of rare and desirable, how far back do stamps that people invest in, how far back do they go? When did they start being created?
Well, Great Britain issued the world's first government-authorized adhesive postage stamp, the famous penny black, picturing Queen Victoria in 1840. Not long thereafter, Brazil and the cantons of Zurich and Geneva in Switzerland followed with their first stamps in 1843. 4 years later, the United States issued its first government postage stamps in 1847, 5-cent stamp depicting Benjamin Franklin, and a 10-cent stamp showing George Washington.
So if you got a hold of one of those, and it had a good grade, and it was in good condition, how much would one of those stamps be worth, roughly?
Well, again, just to kind of give you a benchmark here, I'm looking through our Scott U.S. Specialized Catalog, and I'm turning to the listing for Scott number 1, which is that 5-cent 1847 stamp I told you about. An unused example of that stamp in very fine condition, which is the benchmark grade that is used in the Scott catalogs when assigning values, right now in the 2015 edition of our catalog is valued at $6,750.
And
very fine.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, please go.
A very fine used example of that stamp is valued at $400.
I would have thought it would be higher.
Well, it can be. We also have a section in our U.S. Specialized Catalog that we call the Scott Stamp Values U.S. Specialized by Grade. And in this section of the catalog, we provide extended values in 8 different grades for selected U.S. stamps. So turning to that section and looking at Scott number 1, as I mentioned, the very fine example, unused, with its original gum, $6,750. We equate very fine to a numerical grade of 80 on a 100-point scale. So if we move up the grade ladder and go from, say, very fine to extra fine, which would be a grade of 90 using our grading standards, that stamp we value at $12,000. If you jump up 2 more steps to the highest grade for which we provide values when we have market data to assign values to these stamps, for the grade of 98, which we call the superb grade, an unused original gum example of the 5-cent 1847 is valued at $32,500.
Well, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States is Janet Yellen, and in the course of being considered for her chairmanship, she had to disclose her wealth, and one element of her wealth is a stamp collection worth $50,000. Now that's pretty good, but Bill Gross, who used to be in charge of the PIMCO bond investment company, has quite a few stamps, between 50 million and 100 million, according to some accounts. So these are people who have seriously invested in stamps.
Yes.
So as an investment, does the value of stamps correspond to other elements of the market? Is it a good portfolio balancing with maybe gold or other commodities? How do stamps figure in portfolio diversification?
Well, I guess let me back up a little bit here and just sort of a little bit of a background here on Mr. Gross. What you might not know is that at present he owns the only complete collection of classic 19th century United States stamps.
I'm envious.
It's a very, very impressive holding. And in that sense, using Mr. Gross as an example, yes, one can get rich investing in stamps. Mr. Gross is perhaps the most prominent example in the United States. He was able to put together this collection by applying the same methodical, disciplined approach that he used to build the PIMCO Total Return Fund into the juggernaut it is today, even though he's no longer running it. He has spent years reviewing past auction realizations, tracing the provenance of key items, and waiting until key pieces he needed came on the market. And when they did, using an auction agent for the most part, he bid very aggressively. That's the approach that he has used, and others can use it too. Now, they might not have the financial means that Mr. Gross does, but that kind of an approach, and buying the very best that you can with the funds available to you, will definitely increase your chances of seeing some kind of return on the money you put into your collection.
One imagines Bill Gross talking with CalPERS or some other massive pension fund and putting him on hold because he received an email alert that an element that could complete one of his collections was suddenly available.
Mm-hmm. Well, then, let me come to the question that you just asked a moment ago about the values of stamps corresponding to other values
things,
in the market and so on,
yeah,
and portfolio diversification. Let me say this. Values for high-end stamps in postal history, and by postal history I mean stamps that are still affixed to their original envelopes or package wrappers and that kind of thing. Collectors call all of that stuff, broadly speaking, postal history. These items aren't tied to an established, easily tracked market such as the bullion market for coins. Unlike coins, which people readily understand as having inherent value, stamps are not valued as a fungible product. Moreover, they're made of paper, whereas many coins are made of precious metals. Words gold and silver lend themselves much more easily to an investor mentality. So overall, and I'm speaking for myself now, I would not recommend stamps as a means of portfolio diversification unless you are very knowledgeable about the high-end philatelic market or have the means, as you alluded to earlier, to retain an experienced dealer or other collector who can help you acquire such material.
Well, okay, but generally speaking, do stamps go up, up, up?
The more scarce and rare they are over time, because there's desire on the part of collectors to own such items, yes, their value will go up over time.
But there was a problem in the 1970s, wasn't there, with the value of stamps?
Yes, there was a fair amount of speculation going on back then. I was a kid collector at that point, and I remember being just agog over some of the prices that people were paying for some of the more speculative issues. One of them was a set of 3 airmail stamps issued in 1930 to commemorate the flights of the Graf Zeppelin. They were wildly speculated in, and their prices went through the roof, and then not too long after that, they came tumbling back down to earth. One of your questions you asked me, give a scenario of a less successful stamp investment. Well, this one comes up quite a bit. There were many people thought they could put their kids through college by buying sheets of stamps issued during the 1940s through the 1960s. Hold on to them for 20 years and then cash out. Well, obviously that windfall never happened, and this is why stamps from that time period can be purchased as discount postage from many dealers. You can actually buy them for below face value.
Mm.
So when we get phone calls from someone saying, "Oh, I just inherited my uncle's collection of mint sheets of stamps. What should I do with them?" I candidly tell them you'll get the best return on that material by using them on your mail.
Speaking of which, as we wind down here, I was interested in your thoughts about the following.
Sure.
You say use those old stamps on your mail. Well, a lot of people aren't using mail nearly as much as they used to, because there are other alternatives now, email and so on. And children are not getting used to using mail. I don't know if anybody writes a thank you letter to grandmother. I hope you're teaching your kids to do that. It was a struggle for me.
Yes. My daughters are definitely writers, and they will handwrite their thank you notes to their grandparents and others.
Oh, that's great.
But yes, we do foster that time-honored traditional means of communication.
But one has to surmise that the traditional means of communication will not peter out completely, but will become less prevalent over time. In other words, what I'm getting at is, what are your thoughts about the long-term value prospects for stamps 30 or 40 years from now for a youngster who might be interested in holding them as an investment because of the changing nature of written communication?
Right, yeah. Well, I can tell you, Chris, it's my belief that stamps eventually will be unnecessary as a means of facilitating communication. I think that's inevitable. But nonetheless, the loss of stamps in the mail likely will have little impact on the rare and uncommon, because collectors, as I mentioned earlier, will always seek them out. The desire to possess them will always be there. It has always been thus in the high end of any investor market. So in that sense, the hobby will continue on, regardless of what happens to
Elvis stamps,
modes of communication and so forth.
Even though there won't be any more new Elvis stamps, we will still have the penny black and its early successors.
The penny blacks will always be there, and there will always be Elvis stamps, and there will probably be more Elvis stamps made, because some of the agents that produce them are adept at marketing them to collectors, even though none of those stamps will ever actually be used to mail a letter.
All right, well, finally, Chad, what got you interested in stamps? Do you have any favorite novels or mystery stories with stamp collecting at the center?
Awesome questions. Real quick, my uncle got me started when I was 8 or 9. He bought me a folder to hold sheets of stamps. I remember going with him to visit Maryland Stamps and Coins on Wisconsin Avenue in Bethesda, Maryland. Believe it or not, the shop is still there, and I remember buying stamps with birthday money from owner Herman Most. His son David now runs the retail side, and I bought stamps from him too. I can say that the hobby has blessed me in myriad ways, not the least of which is the privilege of earning a living through one's hobby. Rick Miller, a former Linn's senior editor and fellow Navy veteran, once wryly observed that writing about stamps was like getting paid to eat ice cream. think that sums it up pretty well. And finally, as for stories that have a philatelic flavor, you can't go wrong with Keller, the hitman, cum stamp collector protagonist of mystery writer Lawrence Block. One of the treasures of my book collection, yes, I do collect things other than stamps, is a signed author's copy of the limited edition of Mr. Block's latest Keller novel, Hit Me, which the Mysterious Bookshop published in 2013. Just 20 authors' copies were made available for sale, and I was fortunate enough to snag copy number 18.
Is Mr. Block a customer?
Actually, Mr. Block, for a little while, did write a column for Linn's Stamp News called Generally Speaking, but his various other obligations and commitments forced him to put the column on hiatus for a while. It's my hope to get him back into the pages of Linn's at some point, if I'm able to do so.
All right, so it seems as though there are some reasons to invest in stamps, particularly if you're at the higher end of things. I mean, financial reasons. But underlying and moving through many of your comments, Mr. Snee, is the motive of love.
Oh, absolutely. You've got to have a passion for the hobby, no doubt about that. I think if you really want to get the most out of it, you need to jump in with both feet. And have fun with it. Absolutely.
Well, Mr. Snee, thank you.
You're most welcome, Chris.
And thanks to all of you listening out there. Accredited Investor Markets Radio is produced by Stephanie Strait. I am Christopher Cahill. Let us do this again.
Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe through iTunes or Stitcher, or you can download our app from Libsyn. You can also listen right on our website, www.AIMkts.com. Each week, Accredited Investor Markets Radio brings you news and education about investing with a focus on alternative assets. To see a short written summary of this episode, go to www.AIMkts.com. Accredited Investor Markets Radio is a production of Financial Poise Radio Productions, LLC.